All right, so now that that has been saved to disk, we can go and click load from disk, and we should get some pretty quick feedback on that. Like so. Cool. So now the only thing is after frame 120, it errors out. That's because there's no actual geometry or no files named 121 and so forth. So I'll just throw down a time shift to lock this into a range between 0 and 120. So if I go here to clamp to both, select clamp to both. I'm not going to mess with anything other than this setting right here, and right click, delete channels, and then just change this to 120. So now if we ever go past frame 120, looking at our time shift, it just holds that last frame for us. So now let's see if that helped us at all in our simulation here. So we've got our flip fluid object here, and let's just click play. And it is performing a little bit better. At least we'll be able to iterate with this a little bit faster. Now it's playing back, and we'll just watch this for a second. And we can see that it is starting to do its thing. But there's an important setting that I want to talk about, and that is the outside distance of our suction force. So the outside distance, if we look at what we do when we create VDBs, over here, this VDB from particles, we have this half band voxels, and you can see that this box that's created that outlines this is sort of, there's a little bit of padding on the edges. And if I were to, go up here just temporarily to our VDB from particles and increase this half band voxels, that's more or less increasing the size that exists outside of this sign distance field. That's the amount of space existing outside of it where it's storing values that tell us how far away we are from the surface in a given point in space. Now, we've already baked this in to be 3 half band voxels outside of our actual VDB that we created here. You can see that that carries over when we did our smoothing, and then we cached it out. But now what we want to do is we're going to be using this outside distance and changing that outside distance to determine how far we're reaching outside of this this suction target to grab particles and start pulling them back in towards our actual target. Now down here, you can see that this suction force outside distance is actually linked up to our suction target. If we go to the volume tab, we get a new exterior band here. So what's happening inside the suction target is it's recomputing this volume for us. And if I go and highlight this here, you can see that it creates a much coarser volume for us. In fact, it's a voxel size of 0.04. We could change this if we wanted to, but really it's going to help things perform better if we keep this as low res as possible, because what it's doing is it's actually increasing this outside distance using world space. So if I zoom back out, you can see now it's computing this new VDB for our suction force based off of this value. So if I adjust this outside distance, you can see that it gets as we get closer to our liquid, this will actually play back much faster. So if I'm playing this, you can see our new VDB that's being recalculated based off of our old VDB is playing back quite quickly here. If I increase this value to something like 3, and then we play it back, go to frame 0, you can see how much slower this is ticking by. So it's just important to be conscious of how, kind of controlling how far outside of this liquid we actually need to reach to accomplish the effect that we're going after. So let's start with an outside distance. It's a little bit smaller. Let's do maybe 0.1, or no, let's do maybe 0.3 to start off with. So at the beginning of our simulation, it's reaching out only so far to suck those particles back in. Additionally, just one more note about the suction target is it's also doing a velocity calculation by default, which we're just not going to use for this. I mean, we can let it do its thing. It isn't going to affect us too much, but because we are feeding in a VDB instead of actual geometry, which it expects, we're going to be not able to get our velocity quite in this way, but I don't think that it was 100% necessary to have for this simulation. I thought that it looked fine just using the suction target itself. Back over here in our sim, let's start now with this outside distance set to 0.3 and play back and see see what happens. We should see some liquid might escape and start floating away, which is fine. And also, just to note that this outside distance is also tied to our drag force that was created for us here. And this affects like where particles are able to experience anti-gravity and drag as well. So let's click play. You can see that it's playing back a little bit faster now. And that morph is starting to happen for us nicely. Now we're a little bit low res. I want to see if I can actually increase this maybe to 0.03 on the flip fluid object, just increasing that or decreasing that particle separation slightly to get a better view of what we're working with here. You can see the performance is just about the same, but we get a little bit better of a view. I think also what's happening here is it looks like if I look back at our anti-gravity here, I had set the drag force strength to be super high. I want to give it, I think that was just when we were experimenting earlier on when we were setting this up. I'm just going to decrease this back to its default value, which was 1, so that we can get a little bit more chaotic motion in our morph that's going on here. So if I switch to my perspective view just by hitting spacebar 1, if I don't know if I mentioned I even hit spacebar 3 earlier to switch to my front view, but spacebar 1 brings me back to my perspective. I just want to kind of play this down a little bit to see what it's doing. We're getting this nice liquidy behavior, but it's very, you can see it's very bouncy, and that sort of has to do with what this drag force is actually doing with our particles. You can increase the drag force to actually make it jiggle a little bit less. You can see that force is very strong. So what I might try to do at this point is let's just see if, now this is the challenge with running sims is you want to iterate through things fast by using low particle count, but also you want to eventually increase it, and increasing that particle count can change things dramatically. So what I want to do is let's see if we can decrease this back to 0.02 and see if this behaves any differently for us at this level. So I think what I'm seeing here is that because we are so tight on our geo using this outside distance of only 0.3, we're not getting enough motion where it's like kind of allowed to kind of explode away from this a little bit. So I'm going to see if I can just increase this a little bit. Maybe by the time we get to frame 48, we increase our outside distance to a value of 1. So if we look back over here at our volume, that's actually increasing that force to quite a bit of distance. So hopefully that won't that'll allow the particles to kind of flow around this general shape a little bit more. Let's go back to frame 0, click play. That's starting to look pretty cool. I think that additionally I might try to increase the, because this thing will kind of undulate quite a bit towards the end, I might try to increase the drag as we get to the end of the simulation. I think what I'll also do is decrease maybe the outside distance as we get towards the end. I also want to experiment with maybe just using a little lower suction strength because it seems like everything is adhering really well to the letters, and I want more kind of particles to fly away. So maybe I'll bring the suction strength down to 200,000 to see what that does. And also I think what I'll do is decrease the outside distance to 0.3. See if we can get any of those particles to escape the sim. Just a few. Doesn't look like that did anything. I'm going to do something dramatic and just bring it down by a factor of 10 to 20,000 and click play. You can see that that is actually not enough to hold the liquid in the sim, so we're starting to get some of these drips, which is nice, but I can already tell that we're going to need to increase that force a little bit more. So maybe let's try something like 80,000. This is cool. I like how things are starting to escape here. I just think that it might be a little bit too much. By the time we get to the end, we do still want to have a decent amount of liquid left in our simulation. So I think that also one thing that we'd want to do at this point is, you know, maybe by the time we get to this area, we'd want to increase the radius of that effect. So let's go over here and maybe set some keyframes on both the, let's set some keyframes on the outside distance. So maybe by frame 24, we set a keyframe on our outside distance. I'm just going to turn the brain off down here so that we can you know, do some setting of keyframes without having any issues. And we'll go out to frame 48 and increase the outside distance to 1. And then I'll alt-click to set another keyframe there. Then maybe also additionally, let's just start with a slightly higher suction strength, so maybe 120,000. And we'll go back to frame 1 and turn the brain back on and see what that gets us. That's starting to look pretty cool. I think that also, in addition to keyframing the suction outside distance up, I also want to increase the amount of force as we go through the sim. So I'm just going to turn the brain off. And we've got our suction strength set to 120 here. Maybe set another keyframe there, and we can go out to maybe frame 96. And let's just double this to maybe 240,000, I should say, and alt-click to set a keyframe there. See if we can get it to recover some of these particles that start flying away down here. Let's go back to frame 1 and turn the brain back on and click play. Another thing you can see is as we get to the end of our simulation here, it starts to run really slowly. And that's because the actual flip solver has a gigantic box that we're working with. So let's just decrease that a little bit. Maybe, you know, we'd want to get it to fit into this view so that, you know, particles that leave below like this point are killed. And so it isn't calculating so much. So I'm going to just bring this box size. I'm going to go back to frame 0, so hit escape. Go to frame 0, bring this box size down to something like that. Maybe let's get in here and frame this up and see if we can actually get the vertical height of this to be small enough that we won't see anything that leaves below. So now that we've got that, I'm kind of liking how where we were at with that last one. So I'm going to just recache this real quick just so we can talk about it. So after letting that go, here's sort of where we're at. If I click play, our morph happens. We've got some particles that drip down. That's good. And then we've got these other particles that kind of drift up. But in large part, at the end, we're still getting a lot of undulation, which is all right. But I want to see if we can decrease that a little bit. And the way we can do it is by the time we get to like frame 120, we could do, which is after our main suction animation is finished, we could just increase our drag force here. So I'm just going to click the brain to turn that off, and so that it doesn't recook again. We're going to turn on the drag force strength. We're going to set a keyframe on it, I should say. Hold down Alt and click in that region. And then maybe out to frame 168, we'll really want it to settle down. So we'll just crank this up to 10 and set another keyframe. Whoops, set another keyframe there. So the drag force is going to go from 1 to 10 between frame 120 and 168. And then the other thing we can do is see how you can actually see where the outside suction force, this outside distance actually exists out here. If we go forward a little bit, you can kind of see that there's a kind of divide here where some particles are traveling upwards and some are traveling downwards, and that's like really representing the boundary of where this force is reaching. So we've got some particles escaping and some coming back to our geometry. I think that what I would like to do, and I think that also will help the final geometry look a little bit more accurate, is we're just going to trim this off. So we're going to keyframe our outside distance back down to a very low number. So in the beginning, if we look at our animation editor and select our suction force, and then I just want to grab, which one do I want to grab? I want to grab the outside distance, this first one here, and then I'll just hit the home key to frame that up. So it looks like we go from, on frame 24, we go from a value of 0.3 up to a value of 1. And then we can like leave it at a value of 1 until I think, until about, I'd say about frame 108. So here, we'll set another keyframe on the outside distance at a value of 1, and then I'd say by the time we get to frame 144, we will set this outside distance back to another smaller value like 0.1. And so it's kind of working in tandem with our drag force to kind of just solidify this shape at the end. So I'm going to just go back to frame 0, turn the brain back on, and we'll click play and see what we get. So you can see that at the end here, that text really starts to kind of conform to that shape. It really kind of cleans up. There's still a little bit of extra jiggle, and that can be due to the fact that the forces are still pretty strong at this point. We did keyframe our suction force to go up to a, let's display the suction force, and I'll click the home key. So we did increase the suction force towards the end here to be pretty high. So I might, as it's settling down, actually bring that back down by frame 140. Maybe by frame 120, actually. I'll decrease that suction force back to what it was on this frame. So that was 120. I'll just hold down Alt and drag that keyframe over. Oh, that didn't work. So what I'll do here is I'll just copy this, Control C and Control V again to paste that key over here now. And let's just run this one more time. Not one more time. Let's just run this again. You can see here something interesting kind of happens because I decrease that force. Towards the end here, it doesn't resolve quite yet, and then we get this like kind of jump where the outside distance decreases, and some of these particles have some of these particles are being sort of like allowed to escape a little bit later. So I'm just going to play this down and kind of take a look at what's going on in the last couple frames. I'm liking it. I think that that's looking pretty cool. So now I think what we'd want to do is, in my final example, I used a much higher resolution than this. I did it at a particle separation of 0.05, which is 4 times, which is like a factor of 4 smaller than what we're at right now. You can see that I can try running that. It's probably going to run pretty slow, so it might not work with the recording. But what I'm going to do is just decrease this particle separation down to this insanely low value. Not insanely low. I mean, we just want it to look good, right? So if we go back, here, you can see now that the particles that define the word liquid are very, very well defined. Now I'm going to click play, and we'll just kind of watch for a little bit and see, kind of if any red flags appear initially. But this might take a little while. So I can already tell that this is going to take a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just run a cache. So over here, where we've got our fluid export here, the fluid export is going to import our stuff for us, and then we've got our fluid compressor. I'm just going to tick off cull bandwidth because I don't want it to delete particles that are inside the sim. And then we'll go to the compressed cache. I can see here, it looks like this suction target might not be high res enough because we're getting these little, these kind of angular shapes here. I'm just gonna, my clipping plane's a little bit jacked up right now, so if I hit, spacebar F, that just reframes it and resets my kind of clipping plane. So you can see that there's kind of some weird behavior going on right here. So what I might do is, well, I'm going to leave it for right now, but it might resolve itself in the end. But if it doesn't, that might be something that needs to be dealt with. But I'm going to just run a cache here to see what we get. So our compressed cache, I'm going to let it run for, let's say, 192 frames. And I'm going to put this in another place, similar to where we did before. So cache / $OS / hip name. And this is going to be our compressed cache. So that's good. Yeah. I think that what I'm going to do just to be safe is go to our suction target here and just decrease the voxel size to 0.2. So it's just slightly more defined suction target. And I'm going to go back to my flip fluid object here. Or sorry, I'm going to go back to my fluid export here, and I'm going to run a cache, and I'll be back in a little bit when this is done. So at this point, we kind of get to what I consider to be one of the more challenging aspects of dealing with sims in general. And that's the going from the low-res prototype to the high-res production quality, beautiful-looking liquid sim. Especially the case for liquids and dealing with forces and stuff. Sometimes they don't scale well when dealing with this kind of thing. So what I would do at this point is I would go into the flip fluid object, and maybe, when my final is actually at 0.005. So at about a quarter of the particle separation we're at right now. So what I would do is I would just gradually start inching it up to being that full res that we want to go for, and try and identify any issues as we go along. So the next particle separation I would try is I just cut this in half. So we're at 0.02 right now. I just cut that down to 0.01 and go back to frame 0 and play it and see if we can spot any issues with the sim. So I'm just going to stop this right here. At this point, it looks like I can already tell right now that it looks like way more liquid is actually escaping this sim than what I was originally hoping for, and it certainly doesn't look like the last example we had. So at this point, I would start messing around with trying to change this suction strength and get it looking good for this one, and then maybe even jack it up a little bit further in the end. So basically, if we were to increase this all the way to 0.005 and then cache it out, it would look something like this. I'm just going to go into the fluid export section where we would be doing our caching. I'm just going to load in a temporary cache of a cache that I did earlier that was incorrect. So I'm just going to throw down a file, and I'm going to go to that cache. So we're going to go to the hip file, and I've got this demo cache in here, and we'll just load this one in so we can see what the results would be if we were to jack this all the way up to particle separation of 0.005 and then run it through. So I'm going to use the point unpack points, and so we can actually see our particles here. And I'm going to just play this through. We'll scrub through the timeline a little bit. You can see that by the time we get to the end here, it looks like a lot of this stuff is falling off, and the suction force comes back and starts to bring these letters into their final positions, but it looks like it's thinned out quite a bit. The letters are not as bold as they were initially. If I go back to frame, this frame, these letters are much more filled in, and by the time we get to the end of the sim, they have lost a ton of liquid, and it's not looking so hot anymore. So what I would do, and this is what I did, was I just, this all comes with trial and error. This is all sort of part of the process of doing better looking sims, is trial and error. The suction force that ended up working for me in my situation, for this situation, and this may not be the case for your sim, if any slight variation in the input, and this might throw your results off. So don't be afraid to continue to experiment until you get this right. Really, it's about being just persistent and patient and trying to just run the sim as many times as it takes and tweaking settings until you arrive at a result you're happy with. So what worked for me, was I actually ended up modifying this animation curve. So to do that, this is the animation curve of the suction strength. So you can see I've got the suction strength here, and I'm just going to home it so that we can see the full range of this animation. So with turning, I'm going to turn the brain off so it doesn't cook anymore. So now if we go and look at this, what I ended up doing was I ended up not only increasing this initial suction value, which is at 120,000 right now. I'm actually going to bring the initial value up to 250,000. So let's just, I'm going to grab these 2 points right here on the bottom and jack them up to 250,000. Down here, you can set both those values at the same time in this animation editor. And then I actually want them to peak at a value of 600,000. So I'm going to grab this one that's in the middle at frame 96 and just type in 600,000. This is just, increasing that overall suction force to get the to keep the liquid adhering into this general space. The other thing that I found that happened that helped was to actually start increasing the suction force earlier as well. So actually, this first keyframe that's on frame 48 at 250,000, I actually ended up moving this back to frame 0, and then setting another keyframe at frame 48, which is actually set to 600,000. So I'm basically just copying this keyframe from frame 96 with Control C, going to frame 48 and hitting Control V. So this is what our new animation curve looks like. It starts at 250,000 at frame 1. Then at frame 48, it peaks out at 600,000, holds there until frame 96 at 600,000, then drops down, back down to 250,000 at frame 120. And that's really all I did to get this to work right. Now, I'm going to additionally increase the resolution here on the particle separation. Once again, 2.005. Actually, let's just check. Let's just play it down just a little bit so we can see if it's having the desired effect. So I'm going to just go and turn the brain back on and click play. So I'm going to just stop this right here, and you can see that from these first initial frames, it doesn't look like our liquid is actually escaping at all now. And this is just how much things change. Believe me, I did another cache in between the previous cache that we just looked at and the one that we're going to run when we bring this down to 0.005. It actually changes enough, dropping this resolution in half one more time, that we do end up with escaping particles. So when you get close to the point where you're going to be doing your high-res sim, you're going to want to maybe run the first 50 frames and just check it, to see if it's doing what you want it to do as you get closer and closer to that final resolution that you're going to be using when you render out your final piece of geo. So with that in mind, what we're going to do now is just actually run the cache that gets us the high-res sim, and leaving these settings the same, it will change enough that it'll end up in the end doing what it is that we wanted to do. So I'm just going to go to the flip fluid object and bring this value. I'm going to go back to frame 0 first and bring this value down to 0.05. And when I click play now, it's going to take a little bit. And I'm going to stop this right around here. I can tell at this point that by, about frame 56, it looks like, these particles are not coming back. They are headed out of the simulation, and we should be getting pretty close to a result that we're after. So now it probably would have been wiser for me to cache those frames, before checking them, but whatever. It is what it is. You're going to spend a lot of time waiting, looking at these types of things. So you just kind of get used to waiting and checking your results and knowing what to look for. So now it's time to just run this, to cache this out in general. So I've got my, I had this file cache set up over here just to read in that other example. I'm actually going to set this cache file up now. The first thing I want to do is untick this cull bandwidth. Cull bandwidth will try to remove particles that are visible inside the sim. So if I come forward here, frame 2, cull bandwidth will try to actually clear out particles that are inside a certain voxel distance from the surface of the liquid. And if the liquid's somewhat transparent in the end, that can lead to some undesirable results, I've found. So I just like to generally turn that off when I'm doing anything I think is going to be transparent in the end. And then it's now to our file cache. So we can set up our file cache, the same directory that we'd like to normally do, which is the cache directory. And we're going to call it $os/$hip name. And we want to just cache out to frame 192. In fact, I could just change the bounds of this scene to 192 at this point, and it will update the end frame for us because it has that f-end expression in there. All right, and so now what I'll do is click, let's go back to frame 0 and click Save to Disk. And I will come back when this is done caching. All right, so that cache is done. And so I'm going to click Load from Disk here. And I'm just going to click Play. It sometimes, even though it's loading from disk, these are quite large files, and it sometimes takes a while for it to load. Oh, sorry. I was also going down here to this particle surface preview. This is just allows us to preview the points without having to run it through the surfacing section right over here. So actually what I'll do is I'll just choose particles, and like it says by default, particles and compressed fluid surface. I'm just going to select particles. So it's reading the files off disk. These are the files that it wrote. So they're roughly, they're about 30 megs. It looks like they get up to be about 83 megs tops per frame, and then it drops back down as particles exit the simulation. These files become larger even though we have a consistent amount of particles. The files become larger because they take up more space, and so therefore more voxels are being used in terms of the volumetric simulation. But you can see here that if I sort by date modified, I use this a lot of times after the fact to determine how long a sim took. So it looks like I started at 6:46 p.m. and it finished at 7:15. So just about a half an hour to sim, which isn't too bad. So now what I would do is I would just fire off a flipbook. So let's do that. RF start to 192 looks good, and I'll click start. And I will be back when that is done flipbooking. Let's just make sure that the flipbook actually starts. Sometimes it takes a second, and here it is. So I will be back when that is finished flipbooking. All right, so that is done flipbooking here. I'm going to, let's just increase the size of this a little bit and zoom in and play it back and see what we got. So we got our liquid, we got parts of the liquid falling down, which is cool. And then at the end, we didn't lose too much volume. The font weight feels relatively similar to what it was at the beginning if we look at the last frame and the first frame. Granted, after you may want to start your actual playback of your animation a couple frames in, because it actually reacts to that surface tension that's being applied to it a little bit and gets that kind of liquidy look. But for the most part, we haven't lost too many particles, but we still do get this effect of having the liquid flow away. And I really think that helps sell the fact that we are running a liquid sim and not just like a fancy particle sim that morphs between two different shaped objects. So I'm feeling pretty cool about this. I think we're hitting the target here, which is great. And what's left now is just to do some surfacing. And surfacing for this one isn't going to be that complicated because we did do a pretty high res sim. I'm just gonna I'll just close this right now. Because we did do a pretty high res sim, there's only a couple things I would do to make this to improve upon what the default settings are giving us on our fluid surface cache. So for more in-depth information about this fluid surface cache, please refer to the previous lesson where we go through examples of what different surfacing settings do. But for this one, because it is so chaotic, I don't feel like it needs too much smoothing. So I'm pretty much going to leave the voxel scale where it is. That will help it surface faster. Usually I would decrease this to kind of get a higher res looking mesh, but right now it's pretty chaotic, so it's not really necessary to change that. I also felt that the influence scale, which is sort of how well it sheets out different sheets here, I felt like that worked out pretty well as well with its default setting here. So let's just, on this second particle fluid surface, it just is going to compute here, and there we go. So looking at this, it looks like we've got a nice like sheet that's appearing here. It is a little bit lumpy, and some of these little particles are, they look a little bit blobby, but from back where our camera is going to be situated, and this is all very dependent on your camera and where your camera is located. I found that Sims in general, you're going to want to just push it as far as you can for the frame that you currently are working on. A lot of this stuff will look really great from one camera angle, but will totally fall apart if you decide, oh, hey, let's take the same sim and, kind of zoom in on one part of it. It starts to fall apart and not look quite so realistic after a while. But from way back here, if this is the sim we're running, I mean, it looks great. So it's really a matter of sort of what your camera space is. That's the other thing. Those are things that you want to take into account when you're doing the surfacing stuff. That being said, I think the only thing I would change is maybe let's just bring down the droplet scale. So the droplet scale is really how big these little droplets will appear in general. So I'm just going to bring this down to a value of 0.75. It's very subtle, but if we keep an eye around this area underneath the M, you can kind of see these globs are going to get a little bit smaller and look a little bit more high res when we're done. And it jumped, so it's a little bit harder to see. Let's see. So just going back to our sort of close to what our original framing was, I just want to switch that on and off one more time. So bear with me. I'm going to go, we've got this droplet scale right here. Maybe what I'll do is throw down a null. And actually, I'm just going to freeze this null so that it stores this geometry, so we can refer back to it. Because now if I disconnect this, we've got this sort of just temporarily stored in memory, and we can make a quick comparison. So I'm going to go over here, crank this droplet scale back up to 1, just so we can see what effect it's having. And there we go. So now what I'll do is maybe just view this with the switcher. So if we zoom in over here, if we look at the version that we just did with a droplet scale of 1, that's this second input here. Now, you can see, like, if you just notice the size of these droplets and stuff like that that are sticking out, I find that they look a little bit chunky to me, but we can actually get away with making it appear a little bit more high res by just shrinking that droplet scale. So now look at number 2. Or so the second version with the 0.75 droplet scale. It just makes this look a little bit more high res. If I just A/B between those two, you can kind of see. So we're going to go with option where we have the droplet scale of 0.75. I'm just going to set this so that's working. And now I'm going to just delete these nodes because we don't need them anymore. That was just for visualizing. And now it's time to cache this. I want to cache it using the same file structure we always use. So I'm just going to actually, if I copy all of this, because it's using tokens and because this file cache is named something different, it's called surface cache over here, I can just paste this in, and it's going to write a different file for me. And in fact, you could even save a preset of this. Like I have my versioning preset that basically will just replace this string with the value that is works well with my workflow. So it's going to cache from frame 1 to 192. That's good because we set our bounds. So everything's good there, and I can just click save to disk. And we should get our little pop-up thing. And we're saving to disk. All right, so that has completed caching, and this is what we get. It takes a little bit to load, but if I click playback, you can see that it kind of plays back at sort of a reasonable-ish pace. I think that for complete clarity on this, I want to do another flipbook. But before I do, let's just look at the files that it created for us. So here's my directory that has the cache files that we just wrote out. You can see here that it has, we started at 7:59 and it wrote that surface out all the way until 8:28. So it took just as long, about a half an hour to surface this. And it took also about a half an hour to sim it. So it's one of those things that I didn't really think of initially when I started doing this kind of stuff, is that, wow, after the sim, we really do have to do this extra step that is quite processing intensive. And that's not even rendering yet. We haven't even rendered anything. So just important to note. And the file sizes are roughly, it looks like they're about averaging around 10 megs. Once we get into the section where there's a lot of liquid splashing around, we reach values around 58 megabytes. And then it goes back down to 10 megs towards the end. And so that's also a mesh that is holding on to our velocity attribute too. So our velocity vector is being stored on the mesh itself. If you didn't need to add motion blur to this later on, if you didn't want motion blur, because sometimes you don't, sometimes you can just add motion blur in post or something like that, but you could actually further decrease the amount that this simulation is taking up by having it, if we go to the particle fluid surface node, I'm going to hit escape. If we go to the particle fluid surface node, we could tell it to not transfer attributes, and it would actually create a much smaller file. But we do want that velocity attribute so that we can export it and get motion blur in Redshift. Now, let's just kick off a little flipbook of what we have already here and take a look at what we got. Flipbook is done, and let's take a look at what we got. So this is our fluid surface mesh that we can now kick out as an Alembic file and bring into another piece of software for rendering, or we could do our rendering here if we want. Looks a little bit chaotic as the elements are splitting apart, but once this is shaded and there's motion blur added to it, it is going to look pretty sweet. One thing that I did notice when I was doing this is that everything seems to appear to be in slow motion like this until the very end, and then things speed up a little bit. And the way that I ended up handling this, and you could do this multiple number of ways, but I wanted to have a more consistent speed throughout. I ended up speeding up my final render in After Effects. But you could very well throw down a time shift node and do some time remapping on this at this point, as long as you're speeding things up. Slowing things down might be a little bit difficult because we do have an inconsistent topology. So interpolating frames isn't going to be the easiest thing to do at this point, but you could certainly speed things up, and I don't think anything would be missed. So the next thing we got to do is just kick out an Alembic file of this. So I'm just going to close that, and now after this, I'm going to, after our surface cache and I guess our render, I'll just throw down in attribute delete, because we have a bunch of attributes on here, like our name attribute and these rest ratio detail attributes that we don't need. So let's throw down an attribute delete. And I'll just have it delete everything but the point attributes. And if there are extra point attributes floating around other than velocity or position, I would say to delete those as well. So now we've deleted our attributes. We want to scale this up to 100 by 100%, or we want to scale this up by a factor of 100 so that we can have it be the right size once it gets into Cinema. So if I throw down a transform here, wire this in, and set the uniform scale up to 100, we now have a massive sim. But the cool thing about this is it's actually going to scale. If I go select the transform, it is going to scale our attributes, such as our velocity vector. That's all really important. For the velocity to scale to the size of this new size. If the velocity vector didn't scale, it would actually only think that these amounts had very tiny. That is being scaled. And then the next thing we do is throw down a ROP Alembic output, and we just wire this in here. And I like to do the same thing here. I'm just going to put this into a file that is called hip/abc export. I like to put my ABC files my Alembic files into a different folder so that I know that when I go to save my project and archive it later, I won't need all my cache files. So I can just delete my entire cache folder, but I still will be able to keep my important files in separate folders other than my cache folder. Just a little kind of tip there. Then I'll just name this file based off of the current file name, which is, as we have done before, $hipname.abc. And we want to render the frame range from 1 to 192, so that's all looking good. And what we can do here is just click Save to Disk, and it's going to do another one of these little things where it's writing files. It looks like it's actually going pretty quick. So maybe I won't even stop the recording. I'll just awkwardly sit here and we can just watch this together. Yeah, that's getting slow. I'm stopping the recording. So that's all done caching out now. It took about 2 minutes for it to basically read a bunch of files off of disk and then write a bunch of files back onto disk as an Alembic file. So this is what our Alembic file looks like now. It is a 10 gig Alembic file. So now let's just, and the reason why it's so big is because it's storing that velocity information on it, and it's a bunch of mesh that's changing every frame. There's no like consistent topology between frames, so Liquid Sims can end up getting pretty big. I've seen bigger, trust me. But for this one, we've got basically 10 gigs. We could get this actually probably down to something around 2 or 3 gigs if we actually remove the velocity attributes. If we didn't need velocity, this would be much smaller, but that's just an extra vector attribute that is going to kind of weigh this thing down a little bit. So it's just something to keep in mind. So now what we could do is just hop over to Cinema, and let's just get this thing in and get some motion blur on it and see what we can do. So I'm gonna drag this file into Cinema, and it's going to ask me to do all this stuff, or it's going to ask me about the scale. I don't want to scale it up. We actually set the scale in when we exported it, so I'm just going to set the scale back to 1. It was set to 100 because I had done a previous example where I needed to increase that scale by 100 there, and that's one way to do it. But other than that, I can leave all the rest of this stuff as default and just hit OK. And we get our Liquid Sim in Cinema. So let's see how fast it plays back. It plays back pretty good. When we get to this middle part, it's super heavy because there's just there's a lot of polygons. You can see it even just stops displaying it because it's trying to play back in real time. But so all that's there. That's cool. I think that the next thing that I would check is, we look up here, we've got our 3 vertex tags for our velocities. And these colors don't really mean much right now, but they're basically just the velocity vector broken out into 3 float vertex tags for us. So let's just do some really basic rendering of this so that we can see that it actually so that we can get actual motion blur on this Liquid Sim that we have here. So let's just let's hide that grid. Where is it? There it is. All right. So I'm going to first off, let's just pull up the old Redshift render view. And maybe what I'll do is I'll create a Redshift material, and I'll just drag that on here. And also I'll throw down a Redshift object tag. So I'm going to select this and select the Redshift tags and select Redshift object. And then to get down, well, first off, let's just let's set the Redshift material. So I'm just going to double click on this tag and then go to the RS material and select water. And then let's just add a basic dome light. I'm just going to go Redshift light, dome light, and just render this and see what this gives us. This might look ridiculous, so maybe I'll put a wall behind it just in case the refraction looks weird with a dome light and like not really anything else to reflect it. All right. This is just to make sure we can get that motion blur on our geo, and then you can go buck wild with setting all the shaders up the way you like them. So let's click. Let's just click fire off a render here. And we can see our we've got our liquid here showing up. nicely. And it looks like if we get in real close, yeah, we don't have any motion blur on here. But if I were to say, let's do, let's add that motion vector, those motion vector attributes. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create material for the wall to make it a little bit darker. So let's create, we'll call this the wall, and we'll call this the water or liquid. The wall, I'm going to put that on the plane, and I'll just go over here and set it to a black, or very close to black color, and turn reflections off. And let's just render that one more time, see if it makes the water a little bit more visible. Cool, I think that helped. It helped be able to see these little droplets down here and stuff like that. So now what I'm going to do is let's set up our motion blur. So selecting the redshift tag on the fluid export, I'm going to go to motion blur here. I'm going to select motion vector enabled. And I just want to grab this velocities 0, 1, and 2 for X, Y, and Z, and drag those onto the object here. Hit this clapper with a gear icon up here, and then set the renderer from standard to redshift, and then select redshift. And then under this basic section, I'm going to turn motion blur on, and then I'm going to enable deformation blur. Let's render that one more time. I'm going to hit the clapboard, and I think that by default these velocity vectors end up being way too much. So I'm probably this probably is going to start off looking like an insane blurry mess, and it's going to take a long time to render. Yeah, it's looking nuts. So at least we know motion blur is working, but just to get an idea, I'm going to let this go for just a couple more buckets so we can kind of see how crazy it actually is. Yeah, this is totally over the top in terms of motion blur, so I'm going to just hit that clapboard to stop it one more time. And let's just bring the scale down to a value of 0.1. That seems to be like the value that ends up working for me in most cases. And then let's just hit the clapboard one more time and see what our motion blur is looking like now. And that's looking better to me. Things that are falling down at the bottom look like they're falling. There's some, streaking going on. Obviously, these render settings are garbage, and you need to, go through and refine it a little bit more. But I think we're there. We got it out. We got this morphing technique out of Houdini and into Cinema. And well, that wraps us up for the Flip Fluid simulation chapter. I hope that those examples were fun and that they can serve as sort of a starting point or reference point for you in the future when you're doing your own fluid simulations. In the next chapter, we're going to be looking at some more advanced topics in Houdini, such as the custom solver and building our own infection system using that. And then we're going to look at how we can use Vex, which is very similar to VOPS, except it's all code-based, and it can do just about anything and more that VOPS can do. Really, we're not going to get too deep into it, so don't worry about that, but I think it'll be fun to just get a little bit of perspective and maybe get you excited about learning how to do some more of your own VEX programming. So stay tuned for that chapter, and I'll catch you over there in the next chapter.